October 1st, 331 BC. The plains of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. A 25-year-old Macedonian king stands before the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world. Across the dusty plain, 250,000 Persian warriors wait, war elephants, scythed chariots, the immortals, cavalry from a dozen nations. King Darius III of Persia, ruler of an empire that stretches from Egypt to India, has brought everything he has to crush this upstart Greek invader. Alexander has 47,000 men. The odds are impossible. The stakes are total. But by sunset, Alexander will not just win a battle, he will shatter an empire that has stood for 2 centuries. He will claim the title King of Kings. And he will begin a transformation from mortal warrior to living god, a deification that will echo through history for over 2,000 years. This is not just the story of a battle. This is the story of how a man became immortal. If you want to discover the battles that didn't just change history but created legends, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling us which ancient conqueror you want to see next. This story is about to get legendary. Let's begin. To understand how Alexander became a god at Gaugamela, we must first understand the man who stood on that battlefield. A young king driven by ambition so vast it bordered on madness, haunted by the shadow of his father, and convinced from childhood that he was destined for greatness beyond the merely human. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of Macedon, a kingdom on the northern fringe of the Greek world. His father was Philip II, a brilliant military reformer who had transformed Macedon from a backwater into the dominant power in Greece. His mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus with a fierce temperament and a devotion to ecstatic religious cults. The marriage was political, passionate, and ultimately poisonous. Both parents would shape Alexander profoundly, but in very different ways. From Philip, Alexander learned the art of war. The Macedonian army Philip created was revolutionary. The Sarissa phalanx with its 18-foot pikes, the elite companion cavalry, the integration of light troops and siege engines. Philip was not just a warrior but a strategist who understood logistics, diplomacy, and the use of force as an extension of policy. He gave Alexander the finest military education possible, including command experience while still a teenager. At 18, Alexander led the decisive cavalry charge at the Battle of Kyrenia that secured Macedonian dominance over Greece. But from Olympias, Alexander inherited something equally important, a belief in his own divine destiny. Olympias told her son that his true father was not Philip but Zeus Ammon, king of the gods, who had come to her in the form of a thunderbolt on the night before her wedding. Whether Olympias actually believed this or simply used it as a political weapon against Philip is unclear. What matters is that Alexander believed it, or at least wanted to believe it. The idea that he was semi-divine, destined for achievements beyond normal men, shaped his entire worldview. Alexander's tutor was Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age. For 3 years, from age 13 to 16, Alexander studied under Aristotle at Mysa. What exactly Aristotle taught him is debated, but certainly it included Greek literature, particularly Homer's Iliad. Alexander became obsessed with Achilles, his legendary ancestor on his mother's side. He carried a copy of the Iliad with him throughout his campaigns, sleeping with it under his pillow along with a dagger. He saw himself as a new Achilles, a hero destined for glory but fated to die young. The relationship between Alexander and Philip deteriorated as Alexander matured. Philip took additional wives, which Olympias saw as betrayals. Alexander sided with his mother. At Philip's wedding to a Macedonian noblewoman, one of the bride's relatives made a toast hoping for a legitimate heir, implying Alexander's mixed Greek-Epirot heritage made him unsuitable. Alexander threw his cup at the man. Philip drew his sword and lunged at his own son, but stumbled drunkenly. Alexander mocked him. Here is the man who is making ready to cross from Europe to Asia, and who cannot even cross from one couch to another without losing his balance. Alexander and Olympias fled Macedon. The breach was eventually healed through diplomacy, but the damage was lasting. In 336 BC, during another wedding celebration, Philip was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. Conspiracy theories swirled immediately. Some blamed Olympias, others Persian gold, still others saw it as a personal vendetta. The truth died with the assassin, who was killed while fleeing. At 20, Alexander inherited the throne of Macedon, leadership of the Greek alliance his father had forged, and the planned invasion of Persia that Philip had been preparing for years. He also inherited his father's enemies, both foreign and domestic. Rival claimants to the throne had to be eliminated. Greek cities that saw Philip's death as an opportunity to rebel had to be crushed. And the greatest challenge of all, Alexander had to prove he was not just Philip's son but a leader in his own right, capable of achieving what Philip had only planned. The invasion of Persia would be that proof. But it would also become something more, a quest not just for conquest but for immortality, not just for political power but for recognition as something beyond human. The seeds of Alexander's deification were planted long before Gaugamela, in his childhood dreams and his mother's whispered promises. The battle would be where those seeds bore fruit. The Persian Empire that Alexander set out to conquer in 334 BC was the largest political entity the world had ever seen. Founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC, it stretched from Egypt and Libya in the west to the borders of India in the east, from the Caucasus Mountains in the north to the Arabian deserts in the south. It encompassed dozens of peoples, languages, and cultures. At its height under Darius I, it commanded the loyalty of perhaps 50 million people, more than half the population of the civilized world. But by 331 BC, this great empire was showing cracks. The current ruler, Darius III, had come to power only 6 years earlier through a palace coup orchestrated by the vizier Bagoas. Darius was not incompetent. He had been a capable provincial governor, but he lacked the political legitimacy and the military genius that the crisis demanded. He faced an enemy unlike any Persia had encountered in its 200-year history. Not another empire seeking border adjustments or tribute, but a conqueror seeking to replace Persia entirely. Alexander's invasion had begun 3 years earlier with a crossing of the Hellespont, the strait between Europe and Asia, with an army of about 40,000 men. His first major battle was at the Granicus River, where he shattered the Persian defensive army in Asia Minor through a combination of brilliant tactics and insane personal courage, leading the cavalry charge himself and nearly dying in the melee. The victory opened up all of Western Asia Minor to conquest. For the next year, Alexander campaigned along the coast, capturing the great cities of the Aegean: Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus, Halicarnassus. This was not mindless conquest, it was strategic. The Persian fleet was the most powerful in the Mediterranean, supplied and based from these coastal cities. By capturing the cities, Alexander neutralized the fleet without having to defeat it in naval battle, an arena where the Greeks were outmatched. It was brilliant strategy, but it was slow. Darius had time to prepare. In 333 BC, Darius personally led an army to confront Alexander at Issus, in the narrow coastal plain of southern Turkey. It was the first time the great king himself had taken the field against the invader. Darius brought perhaps 100,000 troops, but the narrow battlefield negated his numerical advantage. Alexander, as at Granicus, led the cavalry charge personally, driving straight toward Darius's position. Persian nobles died protecting their king, but eventually Darius's nerve broke. He fled the battlefield, abandoning his army, his camp, and, most humiliatingly, his family. Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and children. The capture of the royal family was a propaganda disaster for Darius. In Persian culture, The great king was not just a political ruler but a semi-divine figure, the representative of Ahura Mazda on earth. A king who could not protect his own family had failed in the most basic duty. Alexander treated the captive royal women with conspicuous honor, which only highlighted Darius's failure further. The great king had been weighed and found wanting. After Issus, Alexander did not immediately pursue Darius. Instead, he turned south, spending the next 2 years conquering the Levant and Egypt. Tyre, the greatest fortress city of the ancient world, fell after a 7-month siege that demonstrated Alexander's determination and engineering skill. Egypt, long resentful of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. It was in Egypt that Alexander made a pilgrimage across the desert to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the Siwa oasis. What exactly happened at Siwa is shrouded in mystery. Ancient sources say the priests greeted Alexander as son of Ammon, recognizing his divinity. Whether this was standard protocol for pharaohs, political theater, or genuine religious conviction is debated. What matters is that Alexander emerged from Siwa with a confirmed belief in his divine parentage. He began styling himself as son of Zeus, and his companions had to adapt to this new reality. Some accepted it as truth, others as useful mythology, still others as disturbing megalomania. By 331 BC, Alexander was ready for the decisive confrontation. He had conquered the Western Persian Empire, secured his logistics, and achieved a psychological advantage through his unbroken string of victories and his divine credentials. Darius, desperate to stop the invasion before it reached the Persian heartland, gathered the largest army he could muster and marched to meet Alexander on ground of his own choosing. That ground would be Gaugamela. Darius III chose the plains of Gaugamela with care. He had learned from Issus that fighting Alexander in confined terrain negated Persia's numerical advantage. At Gaugamela, the battlefield was a vast, flat expanse perfect for the deployment of large armies, cavalry maneuvers, and, critically, Darius's secret weapons, scythe chariots and war elephants. The king even had the ground leveled in places to ensure the chariots would have unobstructed runs at enemy formations. The Persian army that assembled at Gaugamela was staggering in size and diversity. Ancient sources give wildly varying numbers. Some claim 1,000,000 men, but modern historians estimate perhaps 200,000 to 250,000 troops. The core was the Persian noble cavalry and the immortals, the elite infantry who had guarded Persian kings for centuries. But Darius had also called up contingents from across his empire, Bactrian cavalry from Central Asia, Syrian infantry, Armenian archers, Indian warriors with their war elephants, Greek mercenaries, and cavalry from a dozen satrapies. The scythed chariots were terrifying weapons, at least in theory. These were not ordinary chariots but reinforced vehicles with long blades attached to the axles and yoke, designed to charge into infantry formations and literally cut through ranks of men. Against disordered troops or poorly trained levies, they could be devastating. Against disciplined soldiers who knew how to counter them, they were expensive liabilities. Darius was betting that the Macedonian phalanx, for all its reputation, would break under a chariot charge. Alexander arrived at Gaugamela in late September 331 BC with an army that had been reinforced since Issus but still numbered only about 47,000 men. He had perhaps 7,000 cavalry, including his elite companion cavalry that he personally led, and 40,000 infantry, the core of which was the Macedonian phalanx. This was the Sarissa phalanx that Philip II had perfected, dense formations of pikemen carrying 18-foot spears, capable of creating an impenetrable hedge of points against cavalry or infantry attacks. When Alexander first surveyed the Persian army from nearby hills, even he must have felt a moment of doubt. The Persian line stretched for miles, their numbers so vast that the wings extended far beyond anything he could match. His generals advised caution. Parmenion, his second-in-command and a veteran of Philip's wars, suggested a night attack, using darkness to negate Persian numbers and potentially create panic. Alexander refused. He would fight in daylight, on terms that appeared to favor the enemy. This was not recklessness but psychology. Alexander understood that his greatest weapon was not his army but his reputation. He was undefeated, seemingly invincible, favored by the gods. A night attack, even if successful, would appear sneaky, unworthy of a hero. But if he defeated Darius's massive army in open battle, in daylight, where everyone could see what happened, that would be the stuff of legend. The night before the battle, Alexander did something that astonished his army. He slept. While his troops prepared nervously, checking equipment and making offerings to the gods, Alexander retired to his tent and slept soundly. He had to be woken late the next morning. When asked how he could sleep before such a decisive battle, he reportedly answered that he had been chasing Darius for years while the Persian king refused battle. Now that Darius had finally committed to fighting, Alexander's main worry was over. The rest was just execution. This anecdote, whether true or embellished, reveals Alexander's psychological warfare skills. By sleeping calmly, he projected absolute confidence, which spread to his troops. Meanwhile, Darius and his massive army had stood in battle formation all night, fearing a night attack that never came. By dawn on October 1st, the Persian troops were exhausted before the battle even began. Alexander used the morning to deploy his army with meticulous care. He formed his infantry phalanx in the center, but at an oblique angle, refusing his left flank. His companion cavalry, which he would personally lead, was on the right wing. He created a second line of infantry behind the phalanx as a reserve, unprecedented in Greek warfare. He positioned light infantry and archers to screen his flanks. And he gave explicit orders for how to deal with the scythed chariots. The infantry should open gaps in their formation to let the chariots through, then close ranks after they passed. The missiles of the light troops would kill chariot horses and drivers. As the sun climbed higher, the two armies faced each other across the plain. Darius, magnificent in his royal armor, stood in his chariot surrounded by the immortals and his Persian noble cavalry. Alexander, wearing a distinctive plumed helmet so his troops could always see him, took position with the companions. The battle that would make him a god was about to begin. The Battle of Gaugamela opened not with a massive clash of armies, but with a complex dance of maneuver, as Alexander tried to draw the Persians out of position and Darius tried to use his numbers to envelop the Macedonian force. Alexander began by moving his entire army obliquely to the right, marching at an angle across the front of the Persian line. This movement had multiple purposes. First, it would take the Macedonians off the carefully leveled ground Darius had prepared for his chariots. Second, it threatened to move Alexander's army completely off the Persian left flank, forcing Darius to adjust his line or risk being outflanked himself. Third, and most subtly, it invited the Persians to extend their own line to match Alexander's movement, potentially creating gaps in the Persian formation. Darius took the bait. He ordered his left-wing cavalry to extend further left to match Alexander's movement and to prepare to envelop the Macedonian right. This was exactly what Alexander wanted. The Persian line was stretching, becoming thinner, creating potential weaknesses. But it was also dangerous for Alexander. If the Persian cavalry succeeded in their envelopment, his own right wing could be surrounded and destroyed. As the armies maneuvered, Darius unleashed his first major weapon, the scythed chariots. About 200 of these terrifying vehicles thundered across the plain toward the Macedonian phalanx. This was supposed to be the blow that broke the enemy formation, creating chaos that would allow the Persian mass to overwhelm the Macedonians. But Alexander's troops had been trained for exactly this moment. As the chariots approached, the phalanx performed a complex drill. Sections of the formation opened gaps, creating corridors through which the chariots passed without striking anyone. As the chariots drove through, Macedonian light infantry, javelin men and archers, targeted the horses and drivers from the sides. Some chariots were stopped, their horses collapsing, their drivers killed. Those that made it through the phalanx found themselves behind the Macedonian line with no infantry to attack, where they were quickly overwhelmed by the second line of troops. The chariot charge, on which Darius had spent enormous resources and hopes, achieved almost nothing. Dozens of expensive vehicles and their trained crews were lost, and the Macedonian phalanx stood unbroken. It was a psychological blow to the Persians and a boost to Macedonian morale. Now came the critical phase. Alexander continued his rightward movement, and the Persian left-wing cavalry continued extending to match him. Persian cavalry began to curl around the Macedonian right flank. The envelopment was beginning. But this movement created exactly the gap Alexander had been waiting for. A space opened between the Persian left cavalry and the center where Darius stood. Alexander saw it instantly. Without waiting for orders to spread through his army, without coordinating with his infantry center or his left wing, Alexander made the decision that would define the battle. He wheeled the companion cavalry, all 7,000 of them, and led a charge directly toward that gap, angling toward where Darius himself stood in his chariot. This was Alexander's signature move, repeated in every major battle he fought. The personal cavalry charge aimed directly at the enemy command position. It was tactically brilliant. Killing or capturing the enemy commander could end a battle instantly, but it was also intensely risky. Alexander rode at the very front of the charge. If his horse stumbled, if his unit was surrounded, if a random arrow found him, the entire invasion would be over. The companion cavalry crashed into the Persian line like a thunderbolt. They were not just ordinary cavalry, but the Macedonian nobility, men who had trained from childhood in horsemanship, who fought alongside their king, who would die rather than see him fall. They wore heavy armor, carried long lances, and hit the Persian line with devastating momentum. The Persian troops in that section, a mix of cavalry and infantry who had shifted positions during the maneuvering, were not prepared for the intensity of the assault. The formation buckled. Men died or were ridden down. And Alexander, conspicuous in his plumed helmet and distinctive armor, drove straight toward Darius. This was the moment both kings had been maneuvering toward. The decisive encounter. Alexander versus Darius. Macedon versus Persia. The future of the world, decided by a cavalry charge on a dusty plain in Mesopotamia. As Alexander's companion cavalry smashed through the Persian lines, driving toward Darius's position, the rest of the battlefield descended into chaos. This was not a neat, organized battle proceeding according to plan. It was a massive brawl involving hundreds of thousands of men, with different sectors experiencing completely different fortunes. On the Macedonian left wing, the situation was dire. Parmenion commanded there, and he faced the cream of the Persian cavalry, Median and Bactrian horsemen who were among the finest in the world. They had succeeded in their envelopment, getting around the Macedonian left flank and even reaching the Macedonian baggage train in the rear. Parmenion was under intense pressure, his forces being slowly ground down by superior numbers. In the center, the Macedonian phalanx advanced slowly against the Persian infantry. The Sarissa phalanx was nearly invincible when properly formed and moving forward. The 18-foot pikes created a hedge that no infantry could penetrate and cavalry could not charge through. But it was also slow and relatively inflexible. As the phalanx advanced, gaps began to open between the center and the cavalry on the right. Persian cavalry and infantry began to infiltrate through these gaps. Some of these infiltrating troops circled behind the phalanx and joined the assault on the Macedonian baggage train. Others tried to attack the phalanx from the sides or rear. The Macedonian second line, Alexander's innovative reserve force, moved to counter these threats, engaging in desperate fighting against enemies who had penetrated the primary line of battle. The battle was fracturing into three separate engagements: Alexander's charge toward Darius on the right, the phalanx's grinding advance in the center, and Parmenions' desperate defense on the left. Alexander's army, smaller and outnumbered, was in danger of being overwhelmed despite its tactical superiority. Everything depended on whether Alexander could reach Darius before Parmenions' wing collapsed. As Alexander drove closer to the Persian center, the resistance intensified. Darius's royal guard, Persian nobles, and the immortals closed ranks around their king. These were not ordinary soldiers, but the elite of the empire, men whose honor and lives were bound up in protecting the great king. They fought with desperate courage, trying to halt or slow the Macedonian charge. Contemporary accounts describe vicious hand-to-hand combat as the companion cavalry crashed into the Persian guard. Alexander personally killed men with his lance, then drew his sword when the lance broke. His helmet was dented by a blow that would have killed him if the bronze had been weaker. His horse, not his legendary Bucephalus, who was too old for battle by this point, but a replacement, was killed under him, and he mounted another without pausing. Darius, watching from his high chariot, saw Alexander coming. The Macedonian king was unmistakable with his distinctive helmet, visible through the dust and chaos, driving toward him with single-minded purpose. Darius had two choices: stand and fight, or flee and preserve his life to continue the war from elsewhere. The great king had faced this exact choice once before, at Issus, and had chosen flight. The decision had haunted him for 2 years, undermining his authority and his soldiers' confidence. But now, seeing the Macedonians cutting through his guards, seeing the bodies of Persian nobles who had died trying to stop Alexander's charge, Darius's nerve broke again. He ordered his charioteer to turn and flee. Some of his closest guards tried to stop him, to convince him to stay and rally the army. But Darius was beyond reason. He had seen what Alexander did to armies that stood against him, and he could not face it again. The moment Darius fled, the battle's outcome was decided. Persian soldiers who saw their king's chariot racing from the field understood that the day was lost. The Persian center, which had been holding firm, began to waver. Units started to pull back, trying to disengage. The withdrawal accelerated into a rout. Alexander wanted to pursue Darius immediately, to capture the great king and end the war in a single stroke. But he received urgent messages from Parmenion on the left wing. The situation there was desperate. If the left collapsed entirely, the Persian cavalry could sweep around and attack the Macedonian center and right from behind. Alexander faced a bitter choice: pursue Darius and end the war now, or save Parmenion's wing and let the great king escape once again. Reluctantly, Alexander wheeled his cavalry and rode to reinforce the left wing. It was the tactically sound decision, but a strategic mistake he would regret. Alexander's arrival on the left wing turned the tide there instantly. The Persian cavalry, which had been on the verge of overwhelming Parmenion's exhausted troops, suddenly found themselves facing the companion cavalry that had just shattered the Persian center. The psychological shock was immense. These were the same troops that had driven the great king himself from the field. To stand against them now, with the battle clearly lost, seemed suicidal. The Persian left-wing cavalry disengaged and fled. Some retreated in relatively good order, maintaining formation. Others scattered individually, seeking safety in flight. Parmenion's battered wing was saved, but the respite came too late to prevent heavy casualties. The Macedonian left had suffered more than the rest of the army combined. With both wings of the Persian army broken and the center fleeing after Darius, the Battle of Gaugamela was over. What followed was pursuit and massacre. Alexander's cavalry, once they had secured the left wing, resumed the chase after Darius and the fleeing Persian forces. For miles across the Mesopotamian plain, Macedonian and allied cavalry hunted down Persian troops. Some Persian units maintained discipline and fought rearguard actions, sacrificing themselves to buy time for others to escape. But many more simply scattered, throwing away weapons and armor to run faster. The pursuit continued into the night. Alexander was obsessed with catching Darius, convinced that if he could capture or kill the great king, Persian resistance would collapse entirely. But Darius had a substantial head start, and he was riding hard for the eastern satrapies where he still had loyal forces. Eventually, exhausted and with his horses failing, Alexander was forced to call off the chase. Darius had escaped again. The failure to capture Darius at Gaugamela would have long-term consequences. The war would continue for years as Alexander pursued the Persian king through the eastern provinces, eventually into Central Asia and to the borders of India. Darius would be murdered by his own satraps in 330 BC, denying Alexander the satisfaction of a final confrontation. But on the night of October 1st, 331 BC, Alexander could not have known any of this. What he knew was that he had won the most decisive victory of his life. The casualty figures for Gaugamela are disputed, as with most ancient battles. Ancient sources claim hundreds of thousands of Persian dead, which is almost certainly an exaggeration. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 40,000 Persian casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, compared to perhaps 1,000 to 5,000 Macedonian casualties. The disparity is striking but not surprising. Once an ancient army broke and fled, casualties mounted rapidly as slower soldiers were ridden down from behind or killed by pursuing light infantry. More important than the casualties was what Alexander captured. The Persian baggage train contained enormous wealth, gold, silver, and luxury goods accumulated by the Persian royal house over 2 centuries. Darius's camp was taken intact, with all its treasure and supplies. The psychological impact was as important as the material wealth. Alexander was now not just militarily dominant but immensely rich, able to pay his army and finance further conquests without needing support from Macedon or the Greek allies. In the days after the battle, Persian cities began to surrender. Babylon, one of the greatest cities of antiquity, opened its gates without resistance. The Persian imperial treasury at Susa, containing 50,000 talents of gold and silver, one of the largest accumulations of wealth in the ancient world, fell into Alexander's hands. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, would follow. With each capture, Alexander's power and prestige grew. But the military victory was only the beginning of Alexander's transformation. In the months and years following Gaugamela, he would do something unprecedented. He would take the title king of Asia, adopt Persian royal customs, and present himself not as a foreign conqueror but as the legitimate successor to the Persian kings. He would marry Persian noblewomen, encourage his officers to do the same, and attempt to create a fusion of Greek and Persian elites. Most significantly, he would increasingly insist on being recognized as divine. What had been hinted at after Siwa became more explicit after Gaugamela. Alexander had not just defeated an empire. In his own mind and in the propaganda he spread, he had been elevated by his victory to a status beyond the merely human. The battle had made him a god. The question was whether anyone else would believe it. The ancient world had a fluid boundary between the human and divine in ways modern Western culture does not. Kings and heroes were regularly deified, either after death or sometimes during their lifetimes. The pharaohs of Egypt had been considered living gods for millennia. The question was not whether a man could become a god, but under what circumstances this transformation was legitimate and how others would respond to it. Alexander's claim to divinity was not made suddenly or in a single declaration. Instead, it developed gradually through a combination of religious pilgrimage, military success, propaganda, and Alexander's own increasing belief in his special status. The visit to Siwa in 331 BC had been a crucial step, providing priestly recognition of his divine parentage. But Gaugamela was the moment when that divine status seemed confirmed by results. A god-king should be invincible in battle. Alexander was invincible. Therefore, the logic was not purely theological but also political. In the Persian Empire, the great king was not just a secular ruler but a semi-divine figure, the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity. If Alexander wanted to rule Persia effectively, he could not simply be a foreign conqueror imposing his will by force. He needed to be legitimate in Persian terms, and that meant adopting the ideology of divine kingship. So Alexander began to adopt Persian royal customs. He wore Persian dress, at least on some occasions. He incorporated Persian nobles into his court and his military command structure. He performed the Persian court ceremony of proskynesis, a bow or prostration before the king that Greeks considered appropriate only for gods, not mortal rulers. When Greek and Macedonian soldiers and officers saw Alexander expecting proskynesis, many were shocked and offended. The controversy over proskynesis illustrated the central tension in Alexander's transformation. To rule the vast territories he had conquered, he needed to be more than a Macedonian king. He needed to embody a universal sovereignty that transcended Greek, Macedonian, or Persian particular identities. Divine status was the only framework that could provide this universal legitimacy. But his Macedonian soldiers and officers, who had fought beside him for years, who remembered him as Philip's son and their comrade in arms, found it difficult to accept him as a god. Several incidents highlighted this tension. In 327 BC, a conspiracy was uncovered among the royal pages, young aristocrats who served Alexander personally. Under torture, the conspirators claimed they had acted because Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and pretensions to divinity offended them. The punishment was brutal. The conspirators were stoned to death. But more shocking was the fate of Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew and the official historian of the campaign. Callisthenes had publicly criticized proskynesis and Alexander's divine pretensions. Although not directly implicated in the conspiracy, he was arrested and eventually died in custody. The message was clear. Questioning Alexander's divine status was not just bad policy but treasonous. Another incident involved Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions who had saved his life at the Granicus River. At a drunken banquet in 328 BC, Clitus made disparaging comments about Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his claims to divinity, suggesting that Alexander owed his victories more to his Macedonian soldiers than to divine favor. In a rage, Alexander grabbed a spear and killed Clitus. He immediately regretted it. According to sources, he was racked with guilt for days, but the deed was done. Even Alexander's closest friends were not safe if they challenged his divine status. These violent episodes reveal both the importance Alexander placed on his deification and the resistance it generated among those who knew him best. To the Persians he ruled, to the Egyptians who worshipped him as pharaoh, to the many peoples conquered during his campaigns, Alexander's divine status might have seemed natural or at least politically expedient to acknowledge. But to the Macedonians who had grown up with him, who had fought beside him in the phalanx or the cavalry, it was a harder sell. Yet gradually, through a combination of continued military success, generous treatment of his soldiers, propaganda, and the simple passage of time, Alexander's divinity became an accepted fact of his empire. By the time he reached India in 326 BC, he was worshipped as a god in the cities he had founded across Asia. The transformation of Alexander from conqueror to god had profound implications for the political structure of his empire and for the territories he ruled. Divine kingship was not just a religious claim, but a complete political system that would influence Western and Middle Eastern governance for centuries. In the traditional Greek city-state system, political legitimacy came from citizenship and law. A leader's authority was constrained by institutions, whether democratic assemblies, oligarchic councils, or constitutional limits. Even kings in the Greek world were bound by custom and the need to maintain elite support. But a god-king answered to no one. His will was law, his person sacred. This was a fundamental break with Greek political tradition. Alexander began founding cities across his conquered territories, traditionally said to be 70, though the exact number is disputed. Many were called Alexandria, after himself. These were not just military colonies, but attempts to create a new political order fusing Greek and local elements. The cities had Greek-style institutions, assemblies, gymnasiums, theaters, but they also acknowledged Alexander as divine founder and ongoing patron deity. It was a hybrid system that would shape the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged after Alexander's death. The most visible manifestation of Alexander's divine status was the cult of his person. Cities established temples and priesthoods dedicated to Alexander worship. Sacrifices were offered to him. His image appeared on coins with divine attributes, wearing the ram's horns of Zeus Ammon or the lion skin of Heracles. These were not metaphors or honors in the way a modern leader might be honored with a statue. They were religious worship in the full sense. But Alexander's deification created practical problems, particularly regarding succession. What happens when a god-king dies? In traditional monarchies, succession passes to the heir, usually the eldest son. But Alexander, obsessed with conquest, had not married until relatively late, and when he did marry it was for political reasons, Persian and Bactrian noblewomen to cement his rule over those regions. He had no legitimate son until very late in his life, and that son would be born after Alexander's death. Moreover, how could a mortal heir succeed a god? This question would eventually tear Alexander's empire apart, but in the years following Gaugamela, it seemed distant and theoretical. Alexander was young, only 25 at Gaugamela, only 32 when he died. Immortality seemed more likely than succession. The fusion of divinity and kingship that Alexander pioneered would become standard in the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed him. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, and later the Roman emperors would all adopt variations of divine kingship. The idea that a ruler could be both political sovereign and divine figure, worthy of worship and absolute obedience, became embedded in Mediterranean political culture. But there was a darker side to Alexander's deification. Absolute power, unchecked by institutions or the need to justify decisions to peers, enabled both great achievements and terrible cruelties. After Gaugamela, as Alexander pushed further east into Bactria, Sogdiana, and eventually India, his behavior became increasingly autocratic and brutal. Entire cities were massacred for resisting. Conquered peoples were forcibly relocated. The Macedonian army itself was driven beyond the limits of endurance in pursuit of Alexander's vision of infinite conquest. The tension between Alexander as military genius and Alexander as megalomaniac tyrant has fascinated historians for 2 millennia. Was his deification a brilliant political strategy that allowed him to rule a diverse empire, or was it symptomatic of a psychological transformation from ambitious young king to delusional autocrat? The sources do not give us enough insight into Alexander's interior life to answer definitively. What we can say is that Gaugamela marked a turning point. Before the battle, Alexander could still be seen primarily as a brilliant military commander executing his father's planned invasion of Persia. After Gaugamela, he was something else, a world conqueror operating on a scale and with an ideology that had no precedent in Greek or Macedonian experience. The man who defeated Darius was not quite the same man who would demand worship from his soldiers. The military and political consequences of Gaugamela were immense, but the cultural consequences were equally profound. Alexander's conquest initiated the Hellenistic Age, a period lasting roughly 3 centuries in which Greek culture, language, and ideas spread across the Middle East and merged with local traditions to create new hybrid civilizations. This cultural transformation was not simply imposed by force. Alexander encouraged intermarriage between his Greek and Macedonian soldiers and local women. He himself married Roxana, a Sogdian princess, and later Statira, daughter of Darius III. At a mass wedding at Susa in 324 BC, he married 10,000 of his soldiers to Persian women in a single ceremony. The goal was to create a fused Greco-Persian elite that would have loyalty to both traditions and primarily to Alexander himself. The spread of Greek language was perhaps the most lasting impact. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East, the language of administration, trade, and high culture. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC for Greek-speaking Jews. The New Testament would be written in Greek. The survival and transmission of Greek philosophy, science, and literature was ensured by this linguistic dominance. But the cultural exchange was not one-directional. Greek art was influenced by Persian and Indian traditions. Greek philosophy engaged with Persian and Indian ideas. The cosmopolitanism of the Hellenistic world, the sense that the entire civilized world was interconnected, that one could travel from Athens to India and find Greek speakers and Greek culture everywhere, was Alexander's legacy as much as any military victory. The city of Alexandria in Egypt, founded by Alexander in 331 BC shortly before Gaugamela, became the symbol of this cultural fusion. It housed the Great Library, which at its height contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. The Museum of Alexandria was the research center where scholars from across the Hellenistic world collaborated on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. Euclid systematized geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth. Archimedes studied there before returning to Syracuse. None of this would have been possible without Gaugamela. The battle was the hinge on which the ancient world turned. Before it, the Persian Empire dominated the Middle East and seemed likely to continue for generations. After it, a new world order emerged with Greek culture at its core, but enriched and transformed by engagement with Persian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and eventually Indian civilizations. The religious syncretism of the Hellenistic period was particularly important. Greek gods were identified with local deities, Zeus with Ammon, Hermes with Thoth, Dionysus with Osiris. New cults emerged that blended Greek and Eastern elements. The worship of Serapis, a god invented in Ptolemaic Egypt combining attributes of Egyptian and Greek deities, spread throughout the Mediterranean. This religious fusion would eventually create the cultural environment in which Christianity could emerge and spread, drawing on Greek philosophy, Jewish monotheism, and Middle Eastern mystery religions. Alexander's own deification was a key step in this process. Once the precedent was established that a human could be recognized as divine, the conceptual ground was prepared for later developments. The Roman emperors would claim divine status. Eventually, Christian theology would grapple with the relationship between the human and divine in Christ. The idea that the boundary between mortal and God was permeable, which Alexander exploited for political purposes, had profound theological implications. From a military perspective, Gaugamela also had lasting impact. Alexander's tactics, particularly the use of combined arms, the oblique attack, and the decisive cavalry charge at the critical point, were studied by commanders for centuries. The Romans learned from Hellenistic military theory that descended from Alexander's campaigns. Medieval and early modern commanders read histories of Alexander's battles. Napoleon considered Alexander one of the greatest generals in history and studied his campaigns. But perhaps the most important military lesson of Gaugamela was strategic rather than tactical. That bold, aggressive action, when combined with excellent intelligence and adaptability, could achieve results far beyond what cautious, conventional strategies could accomplish. Alexander with 47,000 men destroyed an empire of millions not through superior resources but through superior decision-making, better training, more effective leadership, and willingness to take calculated risks. The what-ifs of Gaugamela are tantalizing. What if Darius had stood his ground and rallied his army instead of fleeing? What if the Persian cavalry envelopment of the Macedonian left had succeeded before Alexander could intervene? What if Alexander had been killed in the cavalry charge, which came close to happening? Any of these might have changed history. But they didn't happen, and we must deal with the world that resulted from Alexander's victory, a world transformed by a single day's battle on the plains of Mesopotamia. The years following Gaugamela saw Alexander push his conquests to their absolute limits. He marched east through Bactria and Sogdiana, regions corresponding to modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, fighting a brutal guerrilla war against tribes that refused to submit. He crossed into India, defeating King Porus at the Battle of Hydaspes in 326 BC, facing war elephants for the first time on a major scale. He wanted to continue east to the outer ocean that Greeks believed surrounded the world, but his army finally refused. They had been campaigning for 8 years since crossing into Asia, marching thousands of miles, fighting dozens of battles. They were exhausted, and they wanted to go home. Alexander's response to the mutiny at the Hyphasis River revealed how completely his sense of himself had been transformed by his conquests and his deification. He sulked in his tent for days, refusing to speak to anyone, apparently expecting that divine will alone would change their minds. When that didn't work, he finally accepted their decision, but with obvious reluctance and anger. The return journey was marked by unnecessary hardships, a forced march through the Gedrosian desert that killed thousands, that seemed designed to punish the army for their disobedience. By the time Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BC, he was planning new campaigns. Arabia was next, then perhaps a return to the west to conquer Carthage and Rome. The madness, or the vision, depending on perspective, had not diminished. But Alexander's body, pushed beyond human limits for over a decade, was failing. In June 323 BC, he fell ill with a fever. Within 2 weeks, he was dead. He was 32 years old. The question, "Who will succeed?" was allegedly asked of the dying Alexander. His answer, according to tradition, was the strongest. It was not helpful. Alexander's empire immediately began to fragment as his generals, the Diadochi, or successors, fought for control. The wars of the Diadochi lasted for over 40 years, eventually resulting in the division of Alexander's conquests into several Hellenistic kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Syria and Mesopotamia, Macedon under the Antigonids, and various smaller states. But although Alexander's political empire fragmented, his cultural empire endured. The Hellenistic kingdoms all maintained Greek as their administrative language, promoted Greek culture, and claimed legitimacy through connection to Alexander. Cities continued to worship him as a god and founding hero. His image appeared on coins for centuries after his death. His life became the subject of countless histories, biographies, and romances, spreading far beyond the Greek world. There are versions of the Alexander romance in Arabic, Persian, Ethiopic, and medieval European languages. The myth of Alexander as the ideal king-conqueror-hero god shaped political imagination for centuries. Roman emperors compared themselves to Alexander and visited his tomb in Alexandria. Julius Caesar allegedly wept when visiting the tomb, lamenting that Alexander had conquered the world by age 32 while Caesar had accomplished little at the same age. The young Augustus adopted Alexander's hairstyle. Trajan and Caracalla explicitly modeled themselves on Alexander. In the Middle Ages, Alexander remained a legendary figure. The Alexander Romance, a fictionalized biography full of fantastic adventures, was one of the most popular texts, translated into dozens of languages. Islamic tradition generally treated Alexander favorably, identifying him with the figure of Dhul-Qarnayn mentioned in the Quran. Persian literature celebrated him while also critiquing his destruction of the Achaemenid Empire. The historical Alexander, as opposed to the legendary figure, was more complex and morally ambiguous than the myths allowed. He was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, the destruction of cities with millennia of history, the forced displacement of populations. His treatment of his closest friends and companions became increasingly brutal in his final years. The costs of his conquests, both in immediate bloodshed and in the instability created by the collapse of the Persian Empire, were immense. Yet he was also one of the most gifted military commanders in history, a man whose tactical and strategic innovations influenced warfare for 2 millennia. He created the conditions for the spread of Greek culture and the intellectual achievements of the Hellenistic age. And he demonstrated, for better and worse, that a single individual, through a combination of military genius, political skill, and psychological manipulation, could reshape the world. To understand Alexander's deification at Gaugamela, we must examine the broader context of how ancient societies understood the relationship between the human and divine. The modern Western binary, either someone is human or they are God, was not how most ancient cultures conceived the question. Instead, there was a spectrum of being, with gradations between the purely human and the fully divine. In Greek tradition, heroes occupied this intermediate space. Heracles, Achilles, Asclepius. These figures had been born mortal but achieved something beyond the human through their deeds or suffering. They became objects of cult worship, with temples and festivals in their honor. The line between a great hero and a minor god was blurry. Alexander deliberately cultivated connections to these hero gods, claiming descent from Heracles on his father's side and Achilles on his mother's. Egyptian tradition was even more comfortable with divine kingship. The pharaohs had been worshipped as living gods for 3,000 years before Alexander arrived. They were considered the earthly incarnation of Horus and the son of Ra. When Alexander was crowned pharaoh in 332 BC, he automatically became divine in Egyptian terms. The priests at Siwa were not making a radical claim when they hailed him as son of Ammon. They were recognizing what they believed to be obvious based on his position as pharaoh. Persian ideology was more complex. The great king was not quite a god but was the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, ruling by divine mandate. The king's person was sacred, protected by divine favor. Disrespect toward the king was not just treason but blasphemy. Proskynesis, prostration before the king, was the appropriate response to this semi-divine status. Alexander, ruling over peoples with all these different traditions, attempted to synthesize them into a new ideology of universal divine kingship. He was pharaoh to the Egyptians, legitimate great king to the Persians, god king to the cities he founded, and hero descendant of Zeus to the Greeks. This ideological flexibility was essential to ruling such a diverse empire. But it also created tension. Macedonians and Greeks, who remembered Alexander as Philip's son and their military commander, found the transition to god-king jarring. The various plots and conspiracies against Alexander in his later years, including the one that cost Callisthenes his life, reflected this tension. Some scholars argue that Alexander's increasing isolation from his Macedonian companions and his growing reliance on Persian courtiers was a direct result of this tension over divine status. The Roman Empire would face similar challenges when it adopted divine kingship. The early emperors were cautious. Typically, the Senate voted to deify an emperor only after his death, allowing worship of the divine Augustus while Augustus lived could still be treated as a mortal. But as the empire became more autocratic and more influenced by Eastern traditions, living emperors increasingly claimed divine status. By the 3rd century AD, the emperor was Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Early Christians vigorously opposed imperial cult worship, viewing it as idolatry. Christians were willing to pray for the emperor, but not to the emperor. This religious defiance was one reason Christians faced periodic persecution. Refusing to acknowledge the emperor's divinity was not just religious dissent but political subversion. The eventual triumph of Christianity in the 4th century ended the practice of imperial deification in the Roman world, though concepts of divine right monarchy would persist in Christian kingdoms. The long-term impact of Alexander's self-deification was profound. He demonstrated that political power could be legitimated through religious claims in ways that transcended traditional forms of authority. A god-king needed no constitutional limits, no approval from assemblies or aristocratic councils. His will was sufficient. This model of absolute monarchy, sanctified by divine status, would persist in various forms across Eurasia for 2 millennia. From the Hellenistic kingdoms through the Roman emperors, Byzantine emperors, the Islamic Caliphate, which claimed divine guidance if not divinity itself, and into the divine right monarchies of early modern Europe. Whether Alexander genuinely believed he was divine or simply used the claim as political propaganda remains debated. Probably the truth was somewhere in between. He convinced himself of something he found politically useful to believe. But his success in making others believe it, at least enough to accept his rule and worship him in temples, changed the political landscape of the ancient world permanently. As we look back across more than 2,000 years at the Battle of Gaugamela and the deification that followed, what lessons emerge? What does this story of a 25-year-old who conquered an empire and declared himself a god tell us about power, ambition, and the human need for transcendence? First, there is the lesson about the power of belief. Alexander's deification worked not because he possessed any objective divine qualities, but because enough people found it useful or necessary to believe in his divinity. The Egyptian priests had institutional reasons to recognize him as pharaoh god. The Persian nobles who submitted to him needed to believe his rule was legitimate in Persian terms. The soldiers of his army, Macedonian and Greek, needed to believe their suffering and sacrifice were for something greater than mere conquest. By providing that belief, by positioning himself as divine instrument of destiny, Alexander created a unifying ideology for a disparate empire. Second, there is the recognition that extraordinary achievement can create its own reality. Alexander won every major battle he fought. He conquered the known world from Greece to India. He founded cities that endure to this day. These objective achievements created a context where claims to divine status seemed at least plausible. When someone accomplishes what no one else has accomplished, when they seem to operate outside normal human limitations, the boundary between the exceptional human and the divine becomes blurred. Alexander's military genius made his religious claims credible in ways they would not have been otherwise. Third, there is the danger of unchecked power. Alexander's increasing brutality in his final years, the murder of Clytus, the execution of Callisthenes, the unnecessary hardships imposed on his army, stemmed at least partly from his belief in his own divinity. If you are a god, opposition becomes not just politically inconvenient but religiously offensive. Dissent becomes blasphemy. The transformation from Alexander, the brilliant military commander working with his officers and soldiers, to Alexander the autocrat demanding worship and absolute obedience was enabled by his deification. Fourth, there is the question of what constitutes immortality. Alexander died at 32, his body exhausted by years of campaigning and possibly poisoned, though this remains controversial. He achieved no literal immortality. But his fame, his legend, his impact on history, these have endured for over 2 millennia. Cities still bear his name. His tactics are still studied. His life remains a subject of endless fascination. In this sense, his claim to transcend normal human mortality was validated, not through divine intervention but through historical impact. Finally, there is the lesson about contingency and the role of individuals in history. Gaugamela could have gone differently. If Alexander had been killed in the cavalry charge, and he came close, the entire subsequent history of the Hellenistic world would have been different. If Darius had stood firm and rallied his army instead of fleeing, the battle might have dragged on indecisively, eventually forcing Alexander to withdraw. If the Persian envelopment of the Macedonian left had succeeded before Alexander could intervene, the battle could have been lost. But these things didn't happen, and we must deal with the world that resulted from Alexander's victory. That world was profoundly shaped by one man's vision, ambition, military genius, and megalomaniac self-belief. For 3 centuries after Gaugamela, the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East were dominated by Hellenistic kingdoms that traced their legitimacy to Alexander. Greek became the common language of culture and commerce. Philosophical schools flourished in Alexandria. Mathematical and scientific advances built on Greek foundations transformed human understanding of the cosmos. Whether this was worth the cost, the hundreds of thousands who died in Alexander's wars, the destruction of Persian civilization, the instability created by the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire, is a question each observer must answer for themselves. History does not provide simple moral lessons. What is clear is that the battle at Gaugamela on October 1, 331 BC was one of those rare moments when the course of civilization pivoted. Before Gaugamela, the Persian Empire seemed eternal, Greek culture was confined to the Mediterranean, and divine kingship was an Eastern custom foreign to Greek political thought. After Gaugamela, a new world order emerged in which Greek culture dominated, political power was legitimated through divine claims, and the boundaries between human and divine achievement seemed permeable. Alexander set out to conquer an empire. He succeeded. But at Gaugamela, he achieved something more profound and more dangerous. He demonstrated that a man, through extraordinary achievement and brilliant propaganda, could make himself into something more than human. He could become a god, or at least convince enough people that he was one, which in political terms amounts to the same thing. The battle made Alexander immortal. Whether that immortality was blessing or curse, triumph or tragedy, is a question that echoes across the centuries from those dusty plains in Mesopotamia to our present day.